The room fell into an uneasy silence the moment I stepped through the courthouse doors. My father's smirk curled like an old scar, leaning toward my mother as though we were back in church and I was still the messy child who couldn't keep her dress clean. "At least she found a nice uniform to wear," he muttered, loud enough for whispers to stir. A few guests stifled chuckles, but the laughter died in their throats when shame began to taste real. The officiant, an older man draped in a judge's robe, paused mid-sentence. His eyes locked on the silver stars on my shoulders, and his voice faltered before coming out as a whisper that carried across the room, "To Major General." Time froze. Heads turned, mouths closed, and the weight of 20 silent years settled in the space between us. My father's grin vanished, my mother blinked as if she'd seen a ghost. For the first time, they saw who I had become. 2 weeks earlier, I'd been trimming the hedges in my Norfolk yard when a letter arrived, cream-colored paper stamped Seal County Courthouse. I thought it was a mistake until I read the words, "Carter vs. Carter. Petition for property division." My parents were suing me. For a long while, I just stared at that envelope with dirt still on my hands and Knox, my old shepherd, resting his head on my knee. The air smelled of salt and diesel from the nearby shipyard. Somewhere down the block, a flag clinked against its pole in the wind. I laughed, dry, hollow, disbelieving. "Guess they finally found another way to talk to me," I murmured. Knox thumped his tail once, as if he understood. 12 years had passed since I last saw them, 12 years since I walked away in uniform and never looked back. I was 21 when I enlisted, young, angry, and desperate to prove that I could build a life far away from the ghosts of my parents' house. My father had called it running away, but to me, it was the first real act of courage I'd ever taken. The Navy didn't care about family arguments or hometown gossip. It cared about discipline, precision, and endurance, things I could control. The ocean became my first true home, endless and indifferent. It taught me silence, strength, and how to keep moving forward even when the storms hit. Remember the first time I stood on the deck during a night watch, the sky stretched wide and black above me. The hum of the ship's engines felt like a heartbeat beneath my boots. I promised myself that no matter what waited back home, I'd never let it define me again. Years went by, medals came and went, and I learned to wear my scars like armor. Then came the accident, a sudden blast during a rescue drill that tore through the deck and left me sprawled on the steel floor. I woke in the infirmary, my shoulder shattered, my career uncertain. They told me I'd heal, but something inside me wouldn't. The body recovers, the spirit, not always. When I returned home on leave, I barely recognized the woman in the mirror. The uniform still fit, but the eyes staring back had seen too much. My mother greeted me with polite words, my father with silence. They didn't ask about the Navy, the injury, or the medals. It was as if everything I had done was invisible to them. That was the moment I realized, no matter how far I sailed, I could never outrun where I came from. When I moved back home to care for my grandmother, the house felt smaller than I remembered, shrunken by time and silence. The air carried that faint mixture of lavender and old dust, and each floorboard groaned like it was complaining about being forgotten. My grandmother's room faced the garden, the same one I used to run through as a child when she'd call me in for supper. Now, she was too weak to leave her bed, her voice reduced to a whisper that still somehow managed to sound stronger than mine. My father had disappeared by then, not gone in body, but in spirit. He'd left her alone in that hospital, a truth that weighed on me like a uniform I couldn't take off. When I first heard, I didn't know if I was more shocked or disappointed. Somewhere deep down, I had always hoped there was a shred of decency left in him, something human beneath the bitterness. But the man I remembered, all pride and thunder, had already faded into someone unrecognizable. Days turned into a rhythm of care. I learned her medicines, her moods, the way her breathing changed when she was in pain. I read to her at night from the same book she used to read me when I was small, The Old Man and the Sea. She smiled when I did the voices. Sometimes she'd drift to sleep mid-sentence, her frail hand still wrapped around mine. Those moments humbled me in a way the Navy never could. Each morning, as sunlight crept through the curtains, I realized that service doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes, it looks like sitting in the stillness, holding the hand of the person who once held yours. That house, once filled with resentment, began to feel like something else, not a prison, but a kind of redemption. The morning my grandmother passed, the house felt unbearably quiet, like it had taken a breath and forgotten how to exhale. The first thing I noticed was the stillness. No sound of her oxygen machine, no soft hum of her voice calling my name. Just silence, heavy and absolute. I sat beside her bed for a long time, watching the light spill across her face, tracing the wrinkles that held a lifetime of stories. Her hand, once steady and warm, now rested like a folded note, peaceful, final. When the nurse arrived and gently closed her eyes, something in me cracked open. I had faced storms at sea, heard the scream of engines and the chaos of explosions, but nothing prepared me for the soundless kind of grief that filled that room. I wanted to cry, but instead I just sat there, numb, staring at the faint imprint her hand left on the sheet. Days passed in a blur. The house became both a refuge and a reminder. Every room echoed with memories, her laughter in the kitchen, her prayers whispered at dawn. I buried her with the navy pin I had earned during my first deployment. It felt like leaving a piece of myself with her, a final salute. Then, days after the funeral, a letter arrived. My name was written in my father's unmistakable handwriting, sharp, deliberate, almost angry. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. There were only a few lines. If you've come this far, it's time you know the truth. Look in the study. I stood there for a long time, staring at the paper, the words burning into me like a command. For years, I had lived without his voice, and now, through that letter, it returned like an echo from another life. Whatever truth he meant for me to find, I knew it would change everything. I opened the door to my father's study for the first time in years. The hinges creaked like they were protesting the intrusion. Dust floated in the slanted sunlight that spilled through half-closed blinds, illuminating the outlines of his life, a life built on secrets and pride. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and old paper, the same way it had when I was a child sneaking in to watch him write letters he never mailed. On the desk lay a small wooden box, its lid carved with our family's initials. Inside were photographs, my grandmother in her youth, my mother on their wedding day, and me in uniform, standing at a ceremony he never attended. Beneath the photos was another letter, its edges worn, the handwriting slower, shakier than before. I wasn't strong enough to stay, it began. I thought leaving would spare you the pain of watching me fail. But I see now, it only passed the pain to you. The car, the letters, the silence, they were never about running away. They were about fear. You became everything I couldn't. And though I didn't say it, I was proud every single day. My throat tightened as I read. The anger I'd carried for years began to loosen, unraveling like a knot that had finally found its end. I could almost hear his voice again, not the sharp, distant tone I remembered, but softer, regretful, fat in his chair, the letter trembling in my hands, and for the first time in a long while, I let the tears come freely. The house, once filled with resentment and silence, now felt lighter, as if it had been waiting for this moment of forgiveness. I folded the letter and placed it back in the box. Then I whispered, more to myself than to him, "You were wrong about one thing, Dad. I didn't become you. I became me." And for the first time in years, I felt free.